Sex and porn have ravaged this world, and people globally are addicted to both at an astonishing rate. My guest, Timothy Reigle, believes that porn is not a habit to quit, but rather it is a wound which needs to be healed. Tim is an author, a coach, and a former porn and sex addict who broke free after 15 years of addiction.
Christians as a whole have not done a very good job of teaching sexuality to kids, and have not done a very good job of teaching the dangers of porn to kids. This has majorly affected my generation. The millennials are addicted to porn at astronomical rates. Towards the end of my addiction, before I got help, it was sex addiction type of things, where I was having anonymous hookups with people from online, had affairs, and cheated on my wife and those type of things. So the last time I got caught was by two of my good friends at the time, and they outed me. So what are those things that are causing us to have urges to act out through porn and sex? So is it too much social media and going down that wormhole of all the sexualized images on social media? Is it work stress? So to me, the real cause of the porn addiction is that it's an emotional issue. It's not a sexual issue.
Get ready and take notes. Hello, all my beautiful and delicious, sweet, sweet, sweet friends out there, and welcome back to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. I am so happy to be back behind this microphone and recording with you all after my move up here to New York City. I have my friend here today, Timothy Reigle, who's going to be my, inaugural cherry-popping guest, as I am now recording from New York City as opposed to from Baton Rouge. Timothy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I just want to say I'm here for the beard. I'm here for like the hair and everything like that. That face and that beard could be like the cover on men's beard products. I think you might want to look into making that happen.
Well, I appreciate that, but as we'll soon find out in our conversation, this face has gotten me into some trouble sometimes too. So, but I know I appreciate that.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read you look, a little trouble keeps things interesting. Nobody wants to hear about anybody who never got into trouble or never did anything wrong. It just was like perfect, patty all their days. We don't have any use for that. Totally unrelatable and also unrealistic. So I'm here for that trouble because you learn from it and you're here to help other people. So
Sure.
okay, y'all. Timothy Reigle is the founder of Into the Wilderness Ministries. His mission is dedicated to helping men transform their lives by renewing faith, re-energizing families, and restoring masculinity. He is the author of the book Living Porn Free: 10 Steps to Recovery, Redemption, and Renewal. And he's also a coach. And as a coach, he has helped hundreds of men overcome addiction to porn and sex, save their marriages, and become better men. Timothy is also a licensed funeral director, a chaplain, a worship leader, and most importantly, a husband and a father. You're a man after my own heart, dude, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I interviewed a funeral, somebody who's like an embalmer and the funeral home and everything like that.
Yeah,
Adrian.
that's what I do. Yeah, yeah, that's my day job.
And what an interesting interview that was, to handle death like that. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Tell us about your book, please, and tell us about your coaching.
Sure. So all of this came about as a result of my own addiction, my own struggles with porn and sex addiction for over 15 years. A lot of ups and downs and back and forth and heartache and damage to my family, to my marriage, to myself, and finally through it all, praise the Lord, I was able to break free from that and was able to heal and restore my marriage. And I have a, wonderful, happy marriage with my wife of almost 16 years. And through all that, and through my own recovery, I found myself with some opportunities to minister and to mentor some other men, and especially younger men through church and things like that. And It was another something I intended to do. I was kind of like, all right, I fixed my own problem. All right, no need to, you know, empty my closet to the world. But every time I shared a little bit about what I'd gone through, God kind of kicked that door wide open. And so I found myself with more and more opportunities. So I started writing, started a blog, started posting on social media, doing things like that. And I found there was a void there for a need for men to help them find freedom from porn and sex addiction. Now, there's a million different resources for that. There's all kinds of books, there's Bible studies, there's Christian series, there's stuff by counselors, there's secular things. There's all kinds of different resources, and a lot of those are great. A lot of them not so great, but most of them are pretty good. What I found was there wasn't anything to help men. Like, where do I start? Because a lot of these men are just floundering, just treading water, trying to keep their head above water. You know, they didn't know where to start.
Hmm.
And so I created my book, Living Porn Free. I call it a how to quit porn. So it's like, where do I start? How do I stop the bleeding? Right. Because there's a lot of great resources out there that deal with some of the emotional stuff. They deal with some of the practical things and some of the, a lot of the guidelines and a lot of the routines and principles and things that we put in place and the emotional side of it and the psychological side of it and the spiritual side of it. A lot of these men are nowhere near that point. They just need to, like I said, stop the bleeding. And so I created Living Porn Free to be like a 10-step thing to, hey, let's get started here. It may not be perfect, but let's stop the bleeding, figure out what's going on, come up with a plan, and start getting some wins under our belt and focus more on progress over perfection. And so that's where Living Porn Free kind of came out of. And out of that, I was able to start doing some one-on-one coaching. So I've been doing that now about 4 years, working one-on-one individually with men, kind of going through that program and going even beyond that, to help them find freedom from it.
It sounds like that one-on-one touch. I also wanted to mention, that Tim also has his own podcast. It's called the Into the Wilderness podcast also. Now, all of this can be found at your website, intothewildernessblog.com. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
We're going to put that in the showy notes as we always do. Tim is also on Twitter, Instagram. All that's going to go in the show notes. So as I dig into this, so you mentioned God and everything. So I want you to explain to people like your angle of ministry. Are you like churchy type Christian, non-churchy? Because there's a lot of religious trauma that people carry around, and I don't want there to be any like
Sure.
blockages to people receiving what you have to say.
Sure. So I consider myself an evangelical Christian, born again Christian. And I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor for over 50 years. So I grew up with the church. I turned my back kind of on the church and found my way back to the
Yeah.
church. So I have kind of a unique perspective on it because I can see the hurt that a lot of people have from the church because I felt it. Growing up as a pastor's kid, actually, some of the stresses of growing up in a church family, where you literally live next door to the church and your dad's a pastor and you're kind of under the microscope and all of that. That was some of the issues that I had that led to some of my addictive problems. So I
Mhm.
can certainly understand the pain that a lot of people have felt with the church and all different types of churches, and religion as a whole. There's been a lot of unnecessary shame, and hurt. And yes, we should call out sin where there's sin, but we have to do that with love. And so I can understand that side of it, but I also understand how the church can be helpful and it can help us grow and learn and become better men. And it did that for me as well. Once I started working on myself and putting my pieces of my life back together and kind of regaining closer to God, I realized I do need this church community to come around me and help me and lift me up and encourage me. I need that community of believers and especially men to have that brotherhood and that fraternity around there that we can push each other, help each better, keep each other accountable, help each other grow and become better men. So I've seen and experienced both sides of it. So I certainly understand the people that are turned off by church, but I see the benefit of it as well. And I work with men of all different backgrounds and all different faiths. And I primarily work with Christian men. I teach kind of from a biblical Christian perspective, but I work with a lot of men who aren't Christians at all. And I don't believe that overcoming porn and sex addiction is just a Christian issue. It's sin. Don't get me wrong. The Bible says it's sin, but I don't believe that porn is just a bad thing just because the Bible says it's a bad thing. Right. I think that a lot of people are realizing, people who are completely non-religious are realizing that this is a bad thing. It's not just, Christians, slapping people over the head with the Bible and being prudes that are against porn, that there's actually real life damage happening here. And it's not just, old fuddy duddy, legalistic Christians that are pushing this. No, there's actual issues going on as well.
Right. I dig into that, and I think you were explaining that because somebody hearing this will say, well, there was not porn back in the Bible days, therefore you cannot say that the Bible says porn is bad. And I would agree with them because having been in seminary myself and done all of that, one thing I knew about the Bible is it's highly subjective as interpretations, and most people running around thumping it cannot get in there and dig through Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew, and things like that. And if people don't do that, then I'm really not interested in hearing what they have to say because they haven't done their homework. And anybody who has done their homework know how, mm, how difficult those of the Bible is to translate and how much of the human fingerprint is on those translations. And so I hate it when people, unfortunately, get lost, in the help that can happen because there's so much of an emphasis on what sin is or isn't, what it is that is not supposed to be. One thing that drew me to your website was the focus on the, like you said, the damage that it's causing. Okay. And that when we talk about sin, it's always some sort of quantifiable damage. The way I read the Bible and interpret it from the 10 commandments on down, it wasn't just right or wrong for right or wrong's sake. You're hurting yourself or you're hurting someone else. And I found more progress in
Right.
just demonstrating it to people through like a disadvantage to them rather than just saying, well, it's wrong because it's in the Bible, because that's not going to get anywhere with people. And so, but when people can see how they're losing out or they're hurting themselves, whether it's called sin or not is neither here nor there because they can assign a negative value and a negative consequence to it because people are turned off to just like hearing about like church and sin unless it's people within church, which is kind of like pointless because the point of the church is to reach people outside of church. But so you say you work with people from all backgrounds. What about sexual orientations? Because I have a lot of people who are not straight, you know?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I have worked with homosexual men before. I should clarify, first of all, I only work with men. I don't work with any women. I don't work with couples.
No.
I work only with men. I have worked with homosexual men. I've worked with openly homosexual men, and I've worked with men who all classify them as this, that have same-sex attraction and don't want to. Men who feel that they have that attraction and they feel that that's a bad thing for them, and some people may agree with that or disagree with that, but I work with them nonetheless because they need the help. I have my own personal convictions on certain things, but I don't ever turn someone away because they disagree with my theology. I'll put it that way. Because I believe God has given me this mission to help people. He'll work on whatever he needs to work on in the rest of their lives, but this is what I'm here to for, and I'm not going to not help somebody just because we might disagree on something. And to your point, to your earlier point, yeah, it's not, God's not just up there with a list of rules, just saying, "Oh, I'm just going to create all these arbitrary rules and make all these people follow them." He created the rules that he created in what he defined as sin in the Bible, not just because he felt like it, but like you said, because they have consequences. You know, you see when people sinned in the Bible, there were real life consequences. It wasn't just that they made God mad; it's that they things happened. You look at David, for example, who's a very strong example of sexual immorality in the Bible, right? He committed adultery. Well, look what happened from that. His adultery turned into murder, which turned into losing the baby that came from the adultery. And then his whole family fell apart afterwards. So, yeah, it's not just an arbitrary list of rules because God says so. And God didn't put them in the Bible and we obey them because the Bible says so. God made those rules because they're what's good for us and what helps us follow him and worship him and glorify him and keeps us from hurting others and hurting ourselves.
Okay, so then so it sounds like what you're talking about is you like people have like the queer people have come to you asking for like a type of conversion therapy almost. So have you worked
I wouldn't define that. I wouldn't say that it's any sort of conversion therapy or that, and I don't try to change anybody's orientation or identity or anything like that. Some people I've worked with would consider themselves, I'll use this as an example. They would consider themselves to be a straight man, but yet they're attracted to homosexual or some type of porn, you know, but they
okay.
consider themselves to be straight. And so they want help quitting porn, period, not just maybe porn they don't like. I also work with men who watch porn and then they get into real weird, kinky fetish stuff, that they're like, I don't like this. I don't want to be attracted to this,
Mhm.
you know. So I help them break free from those from that addiction from porn and get into things like that because that's what can happen a lot with porn where it escalates, right? So it's you might start off as a curious teenage boy just Googling boobs or something, and as you get,
Really?
which is happens, I mean, but as you get older, then it escalates. And then all of a sudden, just regular vanilla porn isn't enough. Then you got to start looking up more hardcore, more kinkier, more weird stuff. And then it goes into webcams and then it goes into paid stuff. And then, it can go down some dark paths. And so, I work with men who have some of those things where they feel like this has gone down a path that they're not comfortable with and that they don't feel like they are, then I will help them overcome that. But I don't do any type of, you know, conversion therapy or anything along those lines. No.
Okay. Very, very good. So just so I can be as clear as possible. So a queer male could
Sure.
come to you and be like, I'm doing way too much porn. I'm damaging myself, my relationships, and I just want to stop this porn. And there's not going to be any of this. Well, I'm evangelical and we don't believe in the gay stuff and all of that. You'll just use your gift to help him with what he's asking for without judgment.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah. 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 I like I said, I'm not here to try and change those type of things. I may disagree on some of them, but that's not my goal. My goal is to help you find freedom from porn and sex addiction.
Okay, thank you for that lengthy clarification of that. So, 15-year, you said porn and sex addiction. That's damn near long enough to graduate from high school. Can you tell me about the first time you were exposed to pornography, the sort of impression it left on you, and then the very last time you saw it?
I don't remember the specific first time, but I do remember it was kind of honestly, it was kind of the scenario that I just described a few minutes ago of just a hormonal teenage boy just curious, right? With a computer.
And
You know, I'm
booby.
I'm I'm 37, so you're right. I'm 37, so I kind of came into puberty, into adolescence, kind of at the cusp, at the beginning of the internet age, right? So I kind of got hooked on just back then it was freaking dial up, back in 2000, 2001. and kind of got hooked on that. And some of it was because the church in general, whatever the positions that the church might have or their different theologies have, I think that when I say the church, I mean the worldwide church, not a particular denomination, just kind of Christians as a whole, have not done a very good job of teaching sexuality to kids, and have not done a very good job of teaching the dangers of porn to kids. And that's one of my goals, is to, help. Okay, this has majorly affected my generation. The millennials are addicted to porn at astronomical rates. I want to help the next generation, so we have to teach them about this and about the dangers that's involved with it. I didn't really have that. For me back then, there was kind of the purity culture movement, which was, I believe, well intended. I believe in abstinence until marriage. I believe that sex is designed for marriage, but they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, and kind of guilted and shamed people so much that it caused actually worse damage later. So kind of the big three back then were: don't drink, don't smoke, don't have sex. Right? Those were the big no-nos when you were a teenager back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And well, by the time I'm 14, 15 years old and I'm a horny teenage American red-blooded boy, what the hell do you think the three things I wanted to do most were, right? I wanted to drink, I wanted to smoke, and I wanted to have sex, right? I mean, it's your classic, American Pie movie, right? you know, and so I got exposed to those things and got exposed to porn and got hooked on porn. And I was like, this is freaking awesome. You know, I've been told all my life that this is bad and this is wrong and I shouldn't do it and it's a sin, which is true. But I was never really told that why. I was never really told it. It was just kind of, this is just that arbitrary rule, kind of like we were talking about a few minutes ago. I was never really explained to me why or what damage it can do. Maybe it won't do damage now, but 10 years down the road, I'm going to wish I could nip this in the bud when I was a kid, and I didn't. And that's exactly what happened. Um, so
So what was the last?
it
Do you know
the last time would have been about 6 years ago. And I don't remember the specific event, but and some of the stuff when I was towards the end of my addiction before I got help wasn't so much porn, but it was kind of sex addiction type of things where I was having kind of anonymous hookups with people from online and things like that. And I had affairs and cheated on my wife and those type of things. So the last time I got caught was by two of my good friends at the time. So they found out that I had this relationship with this other woman, and they outed me. And so outed me to my wife, to my family, to kind of everybody, and pretty much disowned me. And so that was kind of the wake up call for me. It was kind of the spark that got me to change. In hindsight, I wish it wasn't. I wish that, I'd have recognized all the damage I was doing to my marriage and my family, and that would have gotten me to change.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, it didn't. For some reason, God used these two guys to, you know, to wake me up and to call me to action to change. And I'm thankful for that now and grateful for that. But that was kind of that was the moment that got me to get serious help and put in the work that I needed to find freedom.
Exposure. That's the gift that your friends gave you, because see, when we hide things,
Right.
those things grow. How do I say it? Transparency save lives, secrets kill people. Secrets cause death. Be it
Mhm.
physical death, material death, emotional death, mental death, whatever it is. What they did for you was, as you already know, a blessing, because you couldn't hide anymore. Like when we bring things to the light, something has to be done with it, and you responded well. You could have fought them and caused a scene, which you may have, but eventually you, you know, you turned it around, and you were able to at least alchemize those feelings of embarrassment and humiliation and all of that and shame that come along with that. I know shame is heavy as fuck on a sex addict, but you were able to
Oh, yeah.
alchemize that and turn it into everything that you have done today. I was gonna ask ask you about the damage to your marriage, but you already told me about that. So instead, what I'm going to and unfortunately, it's the same thing that I've heard, a million times over, from people who are addicted to sex and porn. They end up cheating, they lose the relationship and so on and so forth. But though, are you still married to the same woman or is it a different person?
Oh yeah. Yep, we're still married. We separated for a while, but we ended up getting back together. We actually renewed our wedding vows when we got back together and kind of just said, "Hey, we're starting fresh here." And now our marriage is stronger than it ever was. And I'm as much as I don't, I don't recommend this life path for a good marriage,
Mm.
but it actually did make us stronger through it. We came through it. It was hard. It sucked. It hurt, and
For who?
but
Are you
we're
thinking about
stronger and better because
yes, for
both of
you?
us. I mean, obviously there was the hurt and betrayal and everything for her, but I mean,
Right. How
it
did
was
it
it was
hurt
painful
you?
for me to go through too because of all the shame that was attached to it, and then I could see the hurt that I had caused her, the person that I love most in this world, and see that I had hurt her the way you know, and so I had to work on some of those things myself, not just to seek forgiveness from her, but to give forgiveness to myself.
Mhm.
And, that took a long time, but, we decided we were going to stick with this hell or high water. And we stood before God and vowed that we were going to, and darn it, we're going to. And yeah, it wasn't easy. Don't get me wrong. And then there are marriages that don't survive it. And, I think in certain occasions that's okay. And that's the right thing for the marriage to end. For us, it certainly wasn't. I'm thankful that we put in the work and the effort and the forgiveness and sought God's guidance from that, and He brought us through, and we're stronger than ever.
At least you got enough sense to pray. You know? Just
Yeah.
because somebody's out there fucking up and making mistakes doesn't mean how did the highly spiritual woman who raised me, Evangelist Nelson, would always say, just because you're going to do wrong don't mean you have to just what you did wrong tonight, don't mean you have to get up and do it the next day. You can always stop,
Mhm.
and just
Right.
because you're going to do it, you can still be smart about it. So you might as well take the time to invite God along. Lord, I done fucked up here. Help me. You done already done it. You might as well ask for help on your on
Right.
in your blog on your website intothewildernessblog.com. My favorite blog on there, you
Yeah.
have what's called the do's and don'ts of battling porn addiction. One
Mhm.
of the key tenets there is to do not. One of the do nots is to fight the battle alone. So that's like, of course,
Mhm.
I'll let you talk about this, but when I first read it, I was thinking, okay, having people to help you, but having this conversation with you, I'm thinking like spiritually, to have like that spiritual
Yeah,
assistance from that higher power. So can you tell us why people
absolutely.
who know that they're battling porn and sex addiction should absolutely not try to do like a lot of males might instinctively try to do is handle it themselves?
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that certainly is twofold, that we can't fight it alone spiritually, and we can't fight it alone personally either, you know? I know I could not have overcome this without the strength that the God provides, the forgiveness that He provides, and redemption that He provides. No way. You know, I am not strong enough of my own. I won't be. I'll choose sin every time. And the Bible talks about that, how we are dead in our sins.
Mhm.
And so I needed His strength and His guidance to live righteously. That took a lot of that shame away, being, hey, Christ died for my sins, for these sins. He paid the penalty for all the stupid shit I've been doing the last 15 years, right? I don't have to carry that weight. That
Right.
doesn't make what I did okay. It's not a get out of jail free card,
Mhm.
right? There's still earthly consequences to that sin. But I'm not facing eternal judgment because of that sin. Because I confessed it, I asked for His forgiveness and repented of it and turned away and walked away from it. I go and sin no more, as He told the lady in John 8. So we need God, But we also need personal guidance, human guidance. I don't want people to, well, first of all, men try to, like you said, they go, oh, I'm going to do this on my own. I'll just fix it myself. I'll just man up and pull myself up by the bootstraps and fix this shit. And I did that for a long time too, and it didn't get me anywhere. You know, so first of all, they need God. Second of all, you do need a personal, what I think, a mentor, a coach, a brother that can help you through that. The biblical example of that is the prophet Nathan.
Mm,
So I mentioned earlier the story of David and Bathsheba, and
mhm.
most people know that story. Most people don't know the following chapter where the prophet Nathan comes and confronts David about his sin and says, "Hey, you screwed up here, dude. Like you need to you need help." And he was that help and encouragement to him. So men need that. On the practical level, they need accountability. They need someone to check in with them. They need something to encourage them, to support them, to, lift them up when they're down. They may need somebody to give them a kick in the ass every once in a while too, right? So having that, this isn't a battle you fight alone. You need someone alongside you because there's going to be a lot of ups and downs. There's going to be good days. There's going to be bad days. There's going to be days where you feel like, you know what, this is stupid. I'm just going to throw in the towel and quit. You have a relapse or you slip up or something like that, and it's easy to just throw in the towel and give up. You need someone who's there, who's going to be your coach, your mentor, your guide, who's going to be like, no, I'm not letting you give up. You can do this. Dust yourself off and get your ass back in the game, right? And that's what we need, and that's what men need. And so that's what I provide to men through my coaching. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. I don't have a psychological degree. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a theologian. I'm just a man who got through this darkness and by the grace of God got through it. And he laid it on my heart to turn around and help other men through it. So I'm going purely off experience and God's mission for my life. I don't have letters last name.
And nor
So,
and
I'm able to have these conversations with these men and help them in a way that's different from what they would get from like a traditional counselor or therapist or even a pastor.
yeah,
So it's
there's
a lot more intensive and hands-on in that way.
right, there's nothing like real life experience, period.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
degrees and the letters behind our name, very valuable and everything like that, but if you haven't when you live something, it carries an intensity in your ministry to other people. So can you give me an
Right.
example of, like, what you would do with somebody, like, practically? Like, say I'm addicted to porn and sex, and I'm like, "Tim, I can't keep my dick in my pants no matter what I do, no matter where I go. I'm a hoe from the free throw line, and I'm trying to change my ways because I've been for the streets, and I don't wanna be for the streets anymore. Are you giving me homework to take home? Are we meditating? Are we what are we doing?
Yeah.
Say I'm somebody who's not
So
really
s
spiritual at all and not open to prayer.
Right. Sure, sure. So, yeah, my coaching has real hands-on approach and real practical approaches too. It's not just, pray the sin away type of thing. That doesn't, we need to pray about it. Obviously, we just talked about that. But there's a favorite saying of mine, and I don't know who said it, probably butchering the original quote, but it said, "Our faith can move mountains, but God still wants us to bring a shovel. Our faith can move mountains, but God wants us to bring us a shovel." So we still have work to do, right? So I focus on three things in my coaching, and I have those listed as help, habits, and heart. So the help aspect is kind of what I just described. The accountability, that teaching, that guidance, that encouragement, that support. I'm here for you. You know, I'm a brother on the battlefield with you, and I'm not going to leave you on the battlefield alone, right? The second part is habits. So these are kind of the more practical things. So we're going to focus on identifying, first of all, what our triggers are. So what are those things that are causing us to have urges to act out through porn and sex? So is it, too much social media and going down that wormhole of all the sexualized images on social media? Is it work stress? Is it, you know, w- you know, arguments with your wife. What are these triggers that triggers you to have these urges to act out? We're going to figure out what those are. We're going to learn ways to deal with those. We're going to focus on a lot of routines. Routines are very important for me. Having establishing times where you're most vulnerable. Like for me, when I struggled a lot, it was late at night. My wife and kids would be in bed. I'd be downstairs watching TV, scrolling on my phone. You know, one thing leads to another, and then I'm looking at porn. So I had to completely rebuild my evening routine to take away that vulnerable opportunity. I also focus a lot on journaling and tracking your progress. And it doesn't have to be, dear diary type of journaling. It can just be, you know, you can track your progress. Today was a good day. Today was a bad day. Tomorrow, those type of things. We build up boundaries and kind of guidelines for us to follow to make sure we stay in a safe area. This is an example I use a lot. Let's say if you're going off driving along the road and there's a cliff, right? Before the cliff, there's a guardrail, and then there's a rumble strip on the side of the road, and then there's a little white line you're supposed to stay within. Well, it's the same thing with this, is we treat having a relapse with porn and sexual addiction as the cliff. Well, we want to have something here and here and here that we can, if we bump into that, we can course correct before it goes all the way to a full type of thing. So we kind of establish where those kind of checkpoints are and learn to set boundaries in our lives so that we can, like I said, kind of course correct and understand where we are before it's too late. But to me, you can have all the habits in the world. You can have all the practical things in place and all these things. None of it matters if you don't deal with the heart. I say all the time that porn addiction isn't something you quit, it's something you heal. So to me, the real cause of the porn addiction is that it's an emotional issue. It's not a sexual issue.
Mhm.
We become addicted to these things as a means of escape, as a means of coping. So there's something in our lives that we're using porn to run away from. Or maybe there's something we're trying to find through porn that we don't have in our lives that we need. And so I work with men to kind of understand some of the emotional sides of it. I work with a lot of men who've had major trauma in their lives. They've had abuse, they've had neglect, maybe their parents divorced or somebody died or things like that. But I've worked with just as many men who had good, happy, healthy childhoods, myself included.
Mm.
There's still often things in our lives that have happened over the years that caused emotional damage. I'll use an example from my life. I got rejected by this girl when I was in high school. Okay. In hindsight, now 20 years later, gives a shit. Like, who didn't get dumped in high school, right? Like everybody, like you didn't really go to high school if you didn't get dumped by, in high school. So, but that left when I'm a 16-year-old kid and dealing with that and dealing with those emotions, I didn't know how to properly deal with them. So I ran to porn to cope with that. That became my coping mechanism, my escape. And I kept using that as my coping mechanism throughout the rest of my life. So now it may be something in my 30s where, let's say my boss chews me out at work. Okay, that has nothing to do with porn, has nothing to do with sex, has nothing to do with that girl dumping me in sophomore year of high school. But it triggers that same emotional reaction, that fear of rejection that started back then in high school. And so I would use the same thing to cope with that fear, to cope with that pain. And so we have to learn what those things are that cause that emotional damage to us and what they made us believe about ourselves. There's fears of rejection, fears of not being good enough, fears of not being loved, fears that there's something wrong with us, that we're broken, that we're damaged, that we're, beyond repair. And then we have to learn healthy ways to deal with those emotions. And that's where the true healing comes from. That it comes from the inside out. It's not just something that we just willpower ourselves to stop. Discipline's involved with it, but we have to kind of heal that from within and figure out why we went to porn. Why are we using this as our escape and our coping mechanism, and learn to kind of heal that from within.
I think that that's intelligent as fuck. Porn addiction is not a habit to break, it is a wound to heal. I think in my addiction journey, myself and research, all of the shit boils down to that, like something broken within us.
Mhm.
For me, I think that it was like being molested, like, by my uncle or uncles, or I don't know how many fucking
Mm,
people it was when I was like a little boy, like,
yeah.
and it was years into, like, my whole addiction struggle, all of these different types of treatments that I realized that that had happened, and I started having dreams, about, like, my young self being in, like, burning house or whatever the case may be,
Mm,
few years ago. I'm 41 now. You know, it was deep within my subconscious, and when I started doing hypnotherapy, it started to come up. And so from the outside, it looked like I was just running around trying to shoot up drugs and have all these sex with all these guys just for shits and grins. But really, I was still trying to numb that pain from before and dealing with a false association with being able to get attention from males through sex because of that molestation.
right.
See,
Sure.
it so and so and I grew up in church too, Pentecostal, so abusive. They meant well, but still got down. And so, I guess pun intended with that one. So many times, don't dance, don't drink, don't smoke, don't do porn, don't do anything like that. No
Right.
alternatives. And certainly none of this talk about here, like dealing with it on an emotional level.
Right.
The last time that I was, in a mental hospital before I left, one of the social workers was counseling me about the whole molestation thing. He told me that at least 50% of the veterans that come into he's been there like, shit, 30 years, I think he said. He's like 50% of the veterans that come into the psych for with substance abuse issues, 50% of us have been molested or something like that when we were children. Okay. And, like 30 years, he's like, most of us somebody did something to us that they shouldn't have when we were children, and that's where it came from. And he told me,
Yeah.
look, don't give this person control over you anymore. So do you feel like all of that, the acting out that you were doing, whatever part because of what this girl told you? And I want to bring this home because a lot of males like to feel dominant a lot of times,
Mhm.
if not all the time. I don't know. I don't really identify like that on most days, but it kinda do you feel like maybe we give people control over us when we act out through these things if it's stemming from something someone said to us a long time ago or did to us?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. And
Mm,
there's a number of different events that cause that. I mean, I just use that as an example. There's multiple other events in my life that cause emotional things that I didn't know how to deal with. I don't, thankfully I don't have any of the kind of the major traumas. I have no abuse or neglect or any of those type of things. But yeah, I think so. I think those things affect us, even on the conscious and the subconscious level. You know, even if things happen when you're a real little kid, you learn to internalize things. You learn to just drown out the fear and drown out the noise that's going into chaos and the things that are going on around you. And you find a way to make yourself feel safe. And a lot of times porn and sex can make us feel safe. When you look at it from the outside in, it seems like why would you run to be all this promiscuous and do all these sort of things? You know, it seems counterproductive and counterintuitive. And on the surface, someone on the outside looking in, it does. Like a someone's wife, a man who's like myself, who had all these affairs and had all the things. Well, that's crazy. You have a beautiful wife. Why would you be doing those things? It makes no sense. Yeah, it doesn't. But we're not thinking logically. We're thinking emotionally because there's emotional damage there. And so, I didn't have any necessarily one particular person that I could pin all this on. Some people have that. Some people were molested by one person. They could like this person was the cause of all of it. I don't know if it's not really directly giving them power when we seek these things to escape it, but it's like you said, it's still letting them affect us.
mhm.
It's letting it's because we haven't healed from it. We're just trying to run away from it. And a lot of what we have to do to heal that is to turn around and kind of face it, you know, because we're trying to run away from that pain. We're trying to run away from those fears all the time, using porn and sex to mask them when we really need to turn and face them. And And like you said about being dominant, yeah, a lot of men find that through when they don't feel like they're in control, when they don't feel like they are powerful, when they feel weak, when they feel, less than, not good enough for whatever reason. It may be because of trauma, sexual trauma in their life. It could be that, their marriage is falling apart and their wife is nagging them all the time, right? It could be that their boss is picking on them all the time, whatever, it could be anything, but it makes them feel on the emotional level weak and not safe and out of control. And porn and sexual gives them it kind of makes them feel powerful without them being powerful. It makes a man who doesn't feel masculine and wants to feel like I'm the man that can pick up, that women want. If he's not that, porn can make him feel like he has that, even though it doesn't. Right? It can give him that false sense of accomplishment, that false sense of strength, of power, of dominance that he's really looking for, but in his life he's too broken to get there.
Mm.
And so a lot of men use that as kind of a way to feel that because it doesn't require anything of them. It promises all these sort of things, but it doesn't require you to actually go out and be them. It promises that you can be this strong, powerful man without you actually requiring you to be one.
Yeah, like you don't have to
Yeah.
actually take the emotional risks involved and
Right,
actually
right.
demonstrate it.
Well, that's a big part of it is there's no risk, right? If someone's fearing rejection, and that was part of me, fearing rejection, feeling getting shut down, feeling, someone like you're not good enough. Well, with porn, you're always good enough. There's no risk of rejection. They're not going to make fun of you because of your looks. They're not going to make fun of you because you're overweight. They're not going to make fun of you, whatever you might be self-conscious about inside. None of that matters. You're not going to be rejected for any of that with porn. But if you go out in public and try to do that, there's a fear there and there's a risk there. With porn, there's zero risk. And so that's why it becomes that safe option that I talked about for men, even though it's not. And it causes more damage to us the further and deeper we go into it.
What I know, everything you said is so insightful. What I know about habits, having broken many of them in my day and time, is when I was in those habits, Tim, it's like I couldn't imagine my life without them. And it's almost like
Mhm.
that I had to, like, mourn the death of it, the passing of it, and it's true,
Sure.
and I don't think that there's anything wrong with grieving the loss of something that you used to do because, like, say, in the crystal meth world and all of in the drug dealing world, there's a lot of community that went along with that. Treacherous, false
Sure.
community, but still a perception of community, of brotherhood, which you say is very important all the same, and it is important. But, so I had to grieve, I'm not gonna be able to be friends with those people anymore, I gotta let that go. But the
Yeah.
beautiful thing is on the other
Yeah.
side of the detachment and the letting go, I found that I was gifted with better, on the other side, but I couldn't see that. All I could see was that, "My God, I gotta stop doing this thing I've been doing forever. Whatever will I do?" Oh, the lament, but then after, after it was all
Right.
over,
Yeah.
it's so much better on the other side.
Yeah. No, that's very true. Yeah. You kind of have to grieve, even though it's something you know is wrong for you and you know is bad for you and it's causing damage to you. It's still something that is familiar.
Mhm.
And so a lot of the emotional things behind this are fear of the unknown, fear of the unfamiliar, fear of change, and so in a way, we'd almost rather stay in this place that we know that we're comfortable with, that's quote unquote safe, even though we know it's killing us, than risk what's on the other side and what's unknown. But when we have the faith and the perseverance to get there, like you said, you realize, yeah, these people, yeah, there was a close knit there, but it was probably very codependent and very enabling, and kind of, I hear it described a lot as kind of the crabs in the bucket. Somebody tries to climb out and they pull you back down, right? But once you get out, you realize there's freedom there, and you realize there's other people who want the best for you to encourage you and support you and love you through. And if you could find that and get out of that and persevere through that fear of the unknown, then you can find that freedom, find that peace.
The analogy Tim made about the crab pulling the other one down, or as I'm from
Yeah.
Louisiana, as we would say down there, the crawfish pulling the other crawfish back down. We get in the crawfish season, I got a taste for them right now,
Yeah.
baby, yes. What that looks like is, say somebody's trying to get out of porn or stop using drugs, a quote unquote frenemy who's not really who can see that it's a trap doesn't want you to get out, so they'll just give you some free
Right,
drugs
right.
or try to enable you, and it'll look friendly like they're trying to give you something, but really they're thinking they don't want you to get the freedom that they know they're not strong enough to get. And so those friends that you had earlier that outed you, best friends ever. Friends who are going to keep telling you, "Hey, it's okay, keep having sex, go do this, go do that." Those are not your friends. I don't care how silky and sweet and smooth their words are, they're laced with poison, and those people don't like you, and because they don't like themselves, and they're afraid that if you get out, you're gonna make them look bad because they don't have the strength to do it, and it happens all the damn time. So
Yeah.
you hit the nail on
You're
the
you're
head with that
you're
one,
exactly right.
but they don't come bearing horns and fangs. These people are right up close to you.
Yeah.
And so and that reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from the John Wick series when the Asian dude in the last one, he was saying, like, "What good is friendship when it's convenient?" You know
Yeah. That's
you
true.
know, "What good is brotherhood when it's
We
convenient?" With anything.
we need those people, like I was talking about the Nathan before, and doing this alone. We need those people who are gonna have the courage to tell us what we need to hear, not what we want to hear.
Mhm. If y'all get a chance to go through, I think that's in the book of, either Kings or Samuel, where you're talking about Nathan the prophet. Y'all,
Second
Nathan
Samuel,
goes in
Second Samuel.
Second Samuel, he goes in there to read David for filth, is what that was. We would call it.
Yeah.
He it was not a cute conversation because, see, God sees everything that we
No.
had done, everything is known, and, so the Lord simply told Nathan the prophet what David had done. He killed Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, so because he wanted her. I mean, I'm not, and so, yeah, everything was known, and so the Lord made David accountable, and that was that's what we call in the queer circles a reed, honey. Nathan the prophet read David for filth is what happened, but it all worked out for the good, in the end. But David had to go through some things. Okay, so I'll let you go ahead and have the last word. Then I'll ask you our dad jokes, and then that'll be it. Anything that you would like to
Sure,
say at all?
sure. My message that I always try to send to men is that there's always hope. Never give up. There's always hope. And there's going to be moments when people who are dealing with this and have been battling addiction for years where they feel hopeless, they feel helpless, they feel like they're beyond help, they're beyond being fixed, they're broken, they're damaged, they're too far gone, they're unforgivable. God can't forgive somebody like me. Look at how terrible of a person I am. They'll feel like they're so entrapped by this that they'll never find freedom, and that's not true. I know it sounds cliche, but if I can find a freedom, you can. And it's not easy. You have to fight against those forces like you were talking about, the crawfish trying to keep you back in the bucket. You have to fight against those people. You have to fight against these emotions and fears that you've been pushing down and hiding and running away from your entire. You have to kind of be humble and humble yourself and admit that you were doing wrong and that you need help. But that help is there. That forgiveness is there. God loves you. There's people that love you and want you to be free from this. You just need to have the courage to stand up and say, hey, I need help and I want to get out of this. And that's what I encourage you to do.
Wow, I feel nothing but love dripping off of every word you say. Like, I love everything that you just said right now. That's definitely going to be one of my social media clips that I push out there. This whole end part, what you just said right now, tear, it was so like spot on. So, okay. Dad joke number one. What kind of bagel can travel?
Hmm. I don't know.
A plain bagel.
A plain bagel. Ah, you're in New York now. You got to get used to your bagels. You got to find your good bagel shop there.
Oh, I know, I know. Nothing like bagel and some tea, in the morning before you catch the train. And okay, so dad joke number two. What do you call a cat with 8 legs?
Cat with 8 legs. Mm,
An octopus.
octopus. My wife will like that one. She's a cat. She's a cat girl. She loves cats. I'll have to remember that one for her.
So am I. I'm going to be volunteering in Brooklyn. We have a cat cafe, and
Oh yeah, I've been to a couple of those. They're interesting.
yeah, I walked in. I was headed somewhere in downtown Brooklyn, and I looked over to my left, and I said, "What is this miraculous piece of heaven here that has fallen down to me?" And I went in there, and I was like, "Do y'all need volunteers, perchance?" And they were like, "Yeah, on the weekends." And I was like, "You'll be seeing me." And there's cats everywhere. And so final one. Why did the orchestra get struck by lightning?
Hmm. Don't either.
Because it had a conductor.
That's a good one. I like that one. I like
Today's dad jokes are courtesy of today.com. This has been Timothy Reigle. His website is intothewildernessblog.com. You can find him on Twitter, on Instagram, or X, or whatever they're calling Twitter these days. And all this information will go in the show notes. Thank you so much for being a marvelous guest. You have broken me into New York City quite well, and I look forward to releasing this episode. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for taking some time to invest into yourself and into the lives of your loved ones. Please visit us at sexdrugsandjesus.com and check out our resource page, our spiritual service offerings, my blog, my books, and other writings that God has partnered with me to create. Find us on any social media platform. Stay strong, my people, and just remember that everything is going to be all right.